So that's one type of sponsorship, which is by far in the United States, probably the largest number of people that come through to the US on in a permanent way is through the family sponsorship process. Then you also have what we call the business or work sponsorship. So either you have a business that could qualify to allow you to come to the US on a more long-term basis, whether it's a long-term temporary basis or eventually permanent status, or you have an employer who has hired you and you can qualify through certain types of visas to come to the US and eventually become more permanent as well through the employer sponsorship. And then the last area, which is an area I don't practice as much, I have in the past, but I don't anymore, is what we call either asylum, which maybe you've heard of. An asylum basically means that you are in the US, actually, you are in some way be able to arrive at the borders of the US, whether it's at the airport or the Canadian or Mexican border, US Mexican and US Canada border, and arrive and make a claim that you are seeking refuge in the United States, because if you return back to your home country, you would suffer persecution because of your political beliefs, religious beliefs, and a couple of other areas as well. So that is an area of practice that I don't work in. There are very specific attorneys, there are attorneys who work in that all the time. And so it is not an easy process as well. And it can lead to, if your asylum claim is not believed and is not awarded, or you do not receive asylum, it can lead to the referral to removal or deportation, as many people know it. So deportation practice is a different area of immigration law, which I do not practice as well. And when we talk about deportation, this is where the US government is requiring someone who's in the United States to leave the United States, either mainly because they do not have, or the government does not consider them to be having legal status. And you can even have deportation in a case where someone who is a permanent resident, but they have committed certain crimes or have not remained in the United States a sufficient amount of time, and they can also be deported as well. And so those are kind of the basic areas of immigration law that are the basic outline of immigration law. In the areas that I want to just talk a little bit more about specifically is the family immigration and the business work immigration. And I'll start with family. So with family immigration, many people may be familiar with that or have been involved in that system, but it is limited to certain relationships. So sometimes we get people that say, well, can I sponsor my cousin, or can I sponsor my brother and sister? Can I sponsor my aunt and uncle? And so the answer is, it just really depends. Well, it doesn't depend for aunts and uncles. It doesn't depend for cousins. So for those relationships, they are too far out. The US pretty much limits the relationships that can be sponsored, family relationships that can be sponsored, to parents, children, spouse, and siblings, brothers and sisters. But even then, you have to know what the excuse me, the US sponsor, who the US sponsor is. So only permanent residents and US citizens can sponsor family members. So to break it down, US citizens, if you're a US citizen, you can sponsor your spouse, your children, your parents, and your siblings. If you are a permanent resident, not yet a US citizen, then you can sponsor your spouse and children. So it's limited. So those who are in the US as permanent residents, one of the advantages of becoming a citizen, if you qualify, is the ability to sponsor more family members to come here. But even within that sponsorship, there is a limited number of approvals each year. The government has a quota system, which basically says we are only going to allow a certain number of people to immigrate based on family sponsorship every year. And it is pretty limited. It's around 140,000 per year. It's not a huge number if you compare the number of people who are applying or who actually have applied for that sponsorship. And so as a result, there is what we call a quota, not a quota, but pretty much a line. There's a line waiting, a queue for people to immigrate, even though they have already started the immigration process through their family sponsorship. So for example, people often ask me who are US citizens that I want to sponsor my brother and sister, how soon can they get here? So someone who's a US citizen who has applied for their brother and sister, typically, depending on what country they're from, but on average, the time can be anywhere from 15 to 25 years before that family member, for that brother and sister, can actually come to the United States based on that sponsorship. So it's an incredibly long time. So sometimes that isn't the best way. Sometimes we have to look at other options potentially for that brother and sister to come here. But in some areas, some relationships are very quick. So for example, if you are a US citizen applying for your spouse or children under the age of 21 or your parents, those are what's called immediate relatives. So the advantage to that is that there is no line, there is no backlog of applications for that. And that's because the government has decided that those relationships should not be subject to any quota. So someone who's an immediate relative can pretty much, as long as they get through the processing time, can come fairly quickly, which in most cases can be anywhere from a year to 2 years, which that's still a long time, but it's certainly nowhere near a long wait as it is for other categories there. So that's kind of the basics of family immigration. And then if we look at business or employment immigration, there is a lot, it's a lot more complex in many ways because there's so many different categories. So you can have for family or for employment immigration or business immigration, you can have temporary types of visas, temporary meaning that it does not become, you're allowed to come here for a specific purpose, either for your business or for your employment. And it can be anywhere from 3 years and it can be renewed indefinitely, or in some cases, some visas have limits on how long you can hold that type of visa. So for example, an H-1B visa for professional workers only allows a maximum of 6 years to hold that type of visa unless you can convert, or not convert, but get into the permanent residence process. And then you have some that are only for a year, maybe 2 years at the maximum. So those are temporary types of visas, and they tend to be faster for people to get those types of visas if they qualify, so that they can get here more quickly. But if they want more permanent status, whether it's through business or employment, then there are options that are separate. So a lot of people ask, okay, if I get this type of visa, will it convert to a green card or permanent status? And the answer is no. There's no real conversion between a temporary visa to permanent status. It's just two different tracks. Either you have a temporary visa or you have a permanent visa, and the way you get those are separate from each other. There's no tie to that, although there are some visas that have very similar, some temporary visas that have very similar criteria as the permanent residence track, but we have to look at them each separately so that not to get confused that there's any conversion. So in fact, someone can come on one type of visa and still apply for permanent residence in a different track with totally different qualifications than they did for the temporary visa. So some of the visas, as Praise mentioned, one of the visas that we worked with quite a bit, especially from people from Nigeria or clients from Nigeria, is the O1 visa. And the O1 visa, frankly, does have a high standard, and it really is based on the individual's career and their recognition in Nigeria or any other country. So O1 visa basically says that if you are considered extraordinary ability according to the criteria that the U.S. government outlines, if they agree and you provide enough evidence to prove that you have national or international recognition in your professional field, then the government can issue an O1 visa. An O1 visa is a visa that allows you to come to the U.S. and work in your field. It is not a blanket authorization to work for anyone or work in any career, any other career. It is very specific. So if you qualify, for example, as an outstanding engineer for O1 visa, then when you come to the US, you have to work as an outstanding engineer in the United States as well. And you have to work specifically for either the employer, or if you set up your own business, to sponsor you for your business as well. There are other types of visas that we can talk about, or probably people will have questions about, but I just wanted to emphasize that one, since that is one that fortunately does not have any quota in terms of the limited, in terms of the number of visas that can be issued. There are certain other visas like the H-1B, as I mentioned before, there is a annual quota, so there's a lot of competition for that visa. So many people, for example, that outstanding engineer could apply for an H-1B visa, but it doesn't make sense sometimes because there are over 200,000 people every year competing for about 65,000 available visas. So some of that is a lot of luck in order to be able to even capture one of the types of visas. So the O1 visa does not have that kind of quota. There's no limit on how many people in the world can qualify, but of course there is a high standard of qualifying for that type of visa. And so oftentimes when we do work with clients who have come on O1 visa, they work in their field, they continue to build their credibility, build their recognition, whether it's continuing to be recognized in Nigeria or opening up to doing more in the United States. Once they build that up, we usually look at potentially getting them on the permanent track, because an O1 visa does not, again, convert to anything. You can continue on O1 visa indefinitely, but you have to keep applying for many, many times to continue with that process. So it's that could be pretty cumbersome to continue to apply annually, for example, for that type of visa. So you want to look at permanent status if you want to be here more permanently and eventually become a citizen of the United States. So permanent status really is also limited to usually employment sponsorship. So either you have a job that sponsors you for the visa, or if you qualify, again, some similar to O1, an extraordinary ability green card, or what we call EB1 green card process. Fortunately, that process does not require you to have a specific employer to sponsor you. You can actually, what we call self-petition, which means you apply on your own. And again, the criteria is very similar to O1 to show that you have that national or international recognition in your field and that you're going to continue to work in your field. So an EB1 option is oftentimes the one that most people take if they've got an O1 visa. But there are other options as well. Again, we don't have enough time to go through all of them. I could be here all day talking about the ins and outs of all of those types of processes, but I just wanted to go over those to kind of give a backdrop. And of course, if anyone has questions that don't necessarily apply to these types of visas, I'm happy to answer them as well. So Praise, that's kind of all I have for my presentation at this point. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And for, I mean, you have said a whole lot of things in so short a time that I'm even taking notes. But the first question I would have to ask you is, you know, it's almost as if, and this is my feeling, it's almost as if there's a profiling of Nigerians, you know, to say, don't come to the US. That's my reading, because even I got O1, and you know, I went to the embassy and I was refused the first time. All right. And I couldn't understand why they had to refuse my stamping even after meeting all the requirements and everything. You know, is there an underlying problem between Nigeria and the US that makes it seem like, in fact, that day I remember that almost everyone that went, you know, that same day, they all got a refusal. You know, so I kept wondering, having paid so much, why does this seem as if you're still going to get a no? I have a lady recently who gained admission to New York Movie Academy, you know, and she's paid part of the school fees and everything. And she got in there and they said, oh, she's never traveled before. And because of that, they weren't sure she was not going to come back, despite a letter from my employer. What exactly is going on? And, you know, what do you think is happening?
Yeah, so a lot of it, I mean, I would say that there is some profiling. I mean, to be honest, throughout the world, I mean, you will find differences in how the embassies treat the applicants there. We do find in Nigeria, it does tend to be a lot more difficult, and in other, honestly, African countries, and I guess what you call third world countries as well, it tends to be more difficult than if you're applying in Europe. for example. And so without getting political, I will say that there is some discrimination there, certainly. As an African-American here, I've known discrimination, so I can see it as well. Not in immigration, of course, but in other areas. But I will say that there is some profiling there. It does tend to be, in particular, with the visitor and the student visas in particular. There seems to be a lot of that. And the reasoning that the government gives is, of course, that their job when you meet with a consular officer or an embassy officer is that they have to determine whether or not you intend to actually come to the US for your purpose, whether it's for a visitor visa or a student visa. That, intent is basically what you tell them. And they pretty much have to take that, of course, at face value, unless they feel that there is something else going on there. So a lot of it is pretty much their discretion to decide whether or not someone really does intend to come as a student or a visitor. And what I mean by intend is that the purpose of a visitor visa or student visa is to come for your visit or come as a student and then return back. So it tends to be that the embassies, all embassies, not necessarily just in Nigeria, but all embassies have to look at the background of that individual, their financial ability, and any other kind of support they have in their home country, whether or not they believe, the embassy officer believes that that person will actually return. It also has to do with the numbers of people who have in the past from a particular country come to the US and not returned. I believe they do keep some track of that. So it does influence their thinking. They won't say it specifically, but it does influence their thinking in terms of their belief whether or not someone will actually return. So when you talk about those types of visas, there's a lot of discretion on the part and subjective thinking on the part of the officer when you go to get a visitor visa or a student visa. Other visas like you received, like an O1, that is to me ridiculous that they would not issue a visa for an O1 or a work visa like an H1B or other types of work visas where it has already been determined by the United States here in the US by the Department of Homeland Security, who actually has the jurisdiction to determine whether or not someone's qualified for an O1 visa or an H1B visa or some kind of work visa. So once that determination is made by the US here, there is no reason for the embassy to not approve the visa, except for something like a security risk, that they know something in your background, you have a criminal history, or they have you on the watch list for subversive behavior, that sort of thing. If they don't find that, then there's really no reason not to approve. They would have to, but we do find for the O1 visa in particular that we are seeing more and more of that kind of behavior, which sometimes it could be just lack of training or education about that visa for that officer. I don't know how many O1 visas that the embassy has encountered. I would probably say it's not as many as maybe other areas of the world, but I will say that in Nigeria, that seems to be an issue that we are working on addressing. I don't find that in any other embassy in the world, where O1 visas have that kind of issue. So I think, to me, it's somewhat some discrimination or lack of training on their part. But the point is, though, you are qualified. The government here makes that determination. The embassy cannot re-qualify you and say, oh, you don't qualify for this type of visa. They should, absent any criminal record, they should approve those types of visas. And sometimes, unfortunately, you have to keep going back until they get the point.
Okay, thank you. We have two questions here. Someone says, if you have an American citizen as a father and you are remarried and over 25 years, can your father file for you? Or what is the best pathway? That's the first question in there. The other question is, I'm a lecturer in Nigeria with a PhD and several published papers. What is my fastest route to the US?
Okay, we'll go with the first one. So the person, if correct me if I'm wrong, they are a US citizen? or
The
who is
father is a U.S. citizen. Yeah.
the father is a U.S. citizen,
Yeah.
and the child is 25 years old and married.
Yes, I'm married.
Okay. Yeah. So U.S. citizens can apply for their married children over the age of 21. So that is possible. Definitely the father would have to submit what's called an I-130 application to the government in the United States. Part of that application process requires proof of relationship. So that would be birth certificate showing that the father is the father of the 25-year-old child. However, it is a long process. So as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, there is a quota, a limited number of visas, green card visas available each year. And the relationship also determines how long that will be. So currently for a father-child relationship where the child is married and over the age of 21, that relationship, it will take about 10 years for the child to immigrate. So the 25-year-old would have to wait another 10 years, and perhaps hopefully if it's 10 years, it'll be 35 when they come to the US. So yes, it can happen, but it is not a fast process. You would have to be prepared to wait. Okay.
Yes. The other one is a university lecturer in Nigeria with a PhD and several published papers.
Yes.
Saying what's the fastest route for him?
Yeah. So, you know, it's difficult to give a definite answer for anyone that I just on a call like this, and no lawyer would be able to do that without getting more details. But just generally, I would say that if you have published papers and maybe some other professional activities, you might be able to qualify either through EB. Well, depends on how you want to come. If you want to come on a temporary basis and you have a potential for either setting up a business or potentially being able to, are you able to find an employer here, you might be able to come through H-1B visa, which again is not the best one unless you're working with a university. If you get a university to hire you, you might be able to get an H-1, you will be able to get an H-1B visa to come here and work with that university. But if you don't have a university that's ready to hire you, then what you could look at is getting an O-1 visa. And again, we'd have to look at more of your background, not just the publications. There are other requirements as well. So we'd have to look at your CV, look at and talk to you more in detail to see if you could meet the qualifications for an O-1. O-1 is the fastest way to get here. But again, it's a temporary visa. You will have to keep, after 3 years, you'll have to keep renewing it on an annual basis. So you would want to look at more permanent status. Sometimes though, people who've done well, especially in academia, can come here on directly with a permanent status without having to go through an O-1. So you can do something potentially in EB-1A, which is that extraordinary ability person green card. So that process is more detailed, but it's very similar to O-1. So again, we'd have to look at your CV and see if you qualify. If you qualified and you got approved here in the US, then you would apply at the embassy for an immigrant visa. And that means immigrant visa means basically you're coming here as a permanent resident. It's not temporary, you're coming here permanently. Or you can do a national interest waiver. It's called an EB-2 national interest waiver. And it also depends on your background as well. But what it's saying is that you will be working in a field in the US that will be beneficial to the national interests of the US. So for example, in some scientific area or in education or something like that. So those are the green card options. They will take longer. A temporary visa will be a faster route. But if you are willing to wait a year or two, actually a permanent resident visa is a lot better. You won't necessarily have to have an employer lined up to go through that process. So that might be a better route if you're able to wait a year or two.
Okay, this person say, thank you very much, Anne. It says, my husband's mom filed for him and his brother for over 10 years. When she got to the last stage, she died of cancer and had become unconscious to sign the final papers. This happened over 12 years ago. His elder sisters were born in the US and they are both over 40 years of age. Can they continue the process where their mom left it since it still shows pending and not revoked? What can be done?
Yes. So, the mom has passed away. I wasn't clear about that, or she's unable to.
Yeah. She had filed for them. They've gotten to the final stage. Then she slipped into. She became unconscious because she was dealing with cancer. Then she passed on. She died.
She passed on.
Right.
Okay.
But now they have. He has got a sister. Who is an American citizen. So they asking, how do they continue the process?
Right. So unfortunately, it doesn't transfer. Typically, when the U.S. citizen sponsor passes away, it pretty much ends the process for that child to come here, unless that child is already here in the U.S. And then there is sometimes there's a way to substitute or continue that process. But in this case, since the mother passed away, the brother or sister or the sister can apply for them, but unfortunately it doesn't go back 12 years, for example. It's like starting all over again. So basically we now have another 12 years of waiting to get to the stage where they can now apply at the embassy to come to the US. So yes, the sister can apply for them, but it's not taking over the parents' previous process. It is basically starting a new process for them.
Okay, someone is asking if you're on the queue for family-sponsored immigration. Can you still try other options since the wait is very long? Wouldn't that affect the other one?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So when we get that a lot, yes, you can try other ways. So if because the family process for many can be very, very long, as mentioned. So if you can qualify through an O1, you can still come here. It will not affect your parents or your family application. You'll still be waiting in the queue, but you will still be eligible to come here to proceed with business or work or however you are sponsored to come here on an O1 or an H1B visa. Sometimes you can also qualify for a business visa called an E2, but that means you'd have to be a citizen of some other countries besides Nigeria. So for example, if you're a citizen of UK, you might qualify to do an E2 visa to do a business here. So that there are many, many options for people to come here on a temporary basis, or as I mentioned before, if you can come on your own with with your qualifications, professional qualifications, you don't have to stay with that family application and be in that queue so long, because the queue for employment visas tend to be a lot faster than queues for families. So if you're able to find a job to sponsor you for permanent status, or if you're able to qualify on your own because you have an outstanding career, then that's definitely the better route to go.
I have another question here. Now, please, I must announce to the house, there are questions you're asking that Anne may not be able to answer right away. Usually what we do is you might need to schedule a session. She does a clarity session to know what you are qualified for. And so that might be the route we need to take because there are questions that I think that are not as specific, and I don't think she can answer some of those questions. Now,
yeah,
I have
praise if I may just quickly, and you're absolutely right, and thank you for mentioning that. But it is very important to, I mean, this is a great forum to get that, basic information, just like many people go and they kind of do their own searches, but there's nothing better than talking to an attorney specifically about your situation, because all that general information may not apply to you, and it's very difficult to determine what does and what doesn't. But yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, this person is saying, are there visa sponsorship jobs that can translate to permanent residency in the US, like it is obtainable in the UK?
Oh, so I don't know the specifics for UK, but with respect to US, if you qualify for sponsorship through a job, like let's say for again the H1B visa, certainly you can get that, and if your employer is willing to sponsor you for the permanent status, then yes, that can happen, but it's not tied to you having an H1B visa. They're very separate tracks there. So again, there's no conversion of I have an H1B, now I get a green card automatically, or it becomes something that I only have to put in, a request for it. so for example, we have people who are on H-1B visas. That tends to be the most number of people on temporary work visas is H-1B visas. So if they do a great job for their employer and their employer wants to keep them on longer than 6 years, then the employer goes through what's called a PERM, which is permanent status application, which requires a lot more on the part of the employer than the H-1B visa. So short of it is, yes, you can get permanent status, but it's not necessarily tied to you having a specific type of visa. You just have to figure out which track you're eligible for on the green card or the permanent status.
Okay, someone is asking, I have a sister in New Jersey who became a citizen through the visa lottery and later filed for my mom, who is also now a US citizen. Can either of them file for me? And how long is that likely going to take?
Right. So yes, either of them can file for you. Your mom, if your mom is the citizen, she can file for you. And then of course your sister can. So those are two different categories. And sometimes people do both applications, and it might make sense to do both sometimes. If we talk about the situation that we just talked about earlier, if something happens to the mom, then you have a sibling application already in process rather than having to start over again. So yes, both of them can sponsor, and it might be a good idea for both of them to sponsor. There's nothing that says you only have to have one application. You can have more than one application for a green card. However, processing time is long for both of them. As I mentioned earlier, for brother and sister, it's about 15 years. For if the person is married, then it's different from someone who is not married. So for someone who isn't married, it's still about 10 years. For someone who's married, then it's still probably about 12 years. So all of them are at least a 10-year wait.
Okay.
Each category.
Someone is saying I'm a pastor in Nigeria and I want to set up my church in the US. What is the route to the US for me?
Yeah, so there's different ways. I mean, there is a very specific religious worker visa and temporary visa called an R1 visa. And that is for people who are coming to work in a religious organization. So you do have to have the religious organization first here in the US. So it can't be you come here and with the plan of starting a religious organization. You actually have to have already formed it or have an existing religious organization in the same denomination or non-denomination as yours in Nigeria. So if you can identify, probably the easiest route is to identify a sister church here or a same denomination church here that is willing to work with you to sponsor you to come here as a religious worker, and then work to, if you want to actually help you to set up a new church here in the US. That's probably the best route. But again, this is just general information. So it would be best to talk directly with me and have a clarity session, as Praise mentioned.
Okay. Someone is saying that he has a registered business in Nigeria, and he offers different services, but he wants to expand to the US. Does he need to? Can he register a Nigerian business while still in? Can he register a business in the US while still in Nigeria? And does that give him a visa to move to the US?
So the answer to the first question is yes, you can register a business even if you are not in the United States. There are many people, including our firm, but there are other firms as well and other organizations that can help you to register. What you will need is, first of all, just a decision on where you want your business to be located in the US, because it is very state specific. So for example, if you're going to be in Texas, then you need to register in Texas. Some people register in Delaware, but don't work there. And that could be another way to do that as well. But ideally, it's best to register where you're going to work or have your business operate. So you have to decide that and then work with an attorney or a registration company to get that set up in the US. What the US requires for you to get your company to have a tax ID number. So that's always required for any business. And in order to get that, you would have to provide your passport, your Nigerian passport. And with that Nigerian passport, you actually can get a tax identification number for your company. in the US. So yes, you can do that. That's just to set it up initially. To actually operate here and be able to qualify for a visa to come here, there's a couple of options. One could be with an O1 visa. So your company that you set up here can be your sponsor for the O1 visa for you to come here. But that's very specific, again, to your qualifications to show that your work that you've been doing in Nigeria or the business that you have in Nigeria has national recognition. That might not be the case for many people. So the other option is what's called an L1 visa. So an L1 visa is what's called a multinational transfer visa. And what that means is that you are asking the US to come here to operate your business in the United States, while at the same time you're going to continue operating in Nigeria. So you have to have the Nigerian company operational and operate your business in the US. So potentially it's possible. I will say that the L1 visa, especially for a startup company in the US, is not the easiest type of visa to get. They tend to have almost a 50% denial rate of those visas in the US. So unless you have really a massive, not massive, but you will have quite a bit of capital that you put into the US business, and that you will have a pretty, I won't say large, but a structure where it's going to be, you will be hiring people right away in the US. It's going to be difficult to get an L1 visa. So an O1 might be something more appropriate depending on your background. But again, we need to discuss it further.
Okay, thanks for so much, Anne. This is very enlightening. For people already in the US and out of status, is there any other way to get back to status apart from marriage?
Yeah, that is a very difficult one. And the question is phrased pretty appropriately. Most of the time it has to be through marriage, because the way the government works is that if you have been out of status for more than 6 months, then you really are unable to do something like a green card through employment, for example. Or you definitely are not able, even if you've been out of status for a month or two, you're not able to now switch to maybe student visa or an O1 visa or an H1B visa. Those temporary visas are pretty much off the table once you lose your status or stop or don't maintain your status as a visitor, for example. So the only option typically for most people is through marriage, unless you have under 6 months of being out of status, and potentially you could have an employer sponsor you for permanent status, or if you're eligible for EB1, for example, as an extraordinary ability person, you might be able to apply on that basis. But again, it's on a case-by-case basis. There's not any blanket answer for everyone.
Okay, this person asking, with an existing H1 visa in the US, must it be the same employer you're working for that can sponsor you for a permanent visa? That's one. Then there's another person asking that I currently work for, I have a customer of mine whom I work with, who is a citizen of the US, has a company in the US, but I'm in Nigeria, and has decided to employ me as a financial manager over there in the US. Can the person file for me to come to the US?
Okay, so for the first one, the question was whether they're H1B visa and whether their employer can sponsor them.
Yes.
Is that correct? Yes.
No. It's saying that he has an existing H1 visa.
Right.
But he's asking, must it be the same employer you are working for that can sponsor you for a permanent visa?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. Actually, no, it does not have to be the same employer. It can be any other employer, as long as you meet the qualifications for that job. In fact, for that type of, for the employer-sponsored green card, you do not have to actually work for that employer that's sponsoring you until you actually get the green card. That is the only requirement of when you have to work with that employer. So if you continue working with your H1B employer where you are now, but another employer goes through that process for you for the green card, that's fine. But once you get the green card, you are required to start working with that employer, the sponsoring employer for the green card. And then the next question was whether the US employer can sponsor the individual who's in Nigeria currently.
Yeah.
So yes, they can do, there's two routes. They can do, the faster route would be what's called the H-1B visa, as a professional worker, assuming that they have at least a 4-year college degree for that profession. Then they can do an H-1B. If it's a private employer, not a university employer, if there's competition, as I mentioned earlier, for an H-1B visa, they would have to go into what's called an H-1B lottery. And if they're chosen, then great, they can come and get the H-1B visa at the embassy to come to the US. If they don't want to go that route, or they don't meet that, or they aren't able to get one of those H-1B visas, the employer can still apply for the permanent visa. As I mentioned in the earlier question, you don't have to work with a sponsoring green card employer until you actually get your green card. So even though you're overseas, the employer can go through that process here in the US, do what they need to do to get it qualified. And then once they get to the stage where they've gotten all their approvals, then you can apply at the embassy for the immigrant visa, and you would actually come to the US as a permanent resident with a green card and can start working with that employer at that point.
Okay, final question, I think. Someone is asking, how does someone become a citizen of the US whose green card has been approved? How long does it take?
Sure. So typically, typical processing or typical qualification is you have to be a permanent resident or have your green card for 5 years. Once you have your green card for 5 years, you can apply for citizenship. The exception to that is if you were married to a US citizen for 3 years, then you can apply once you have your green card for 3 years. And if you've been married to that citizen for 3 years, during that time that you have the green card, then you can apply within that 3-year period as opposed to 5. So, and there are some other exceptions, but they're very different. It's like joining the military and things like that. So basically, most people, if they have not applied through a US citizen spouse, or they have not been married to a US citizen for that 3-year period, then they have to wait 5 years in order to get the green card. I mean, the citizenship.
Yeah, I mean, and you just talked about joining the military. If someone joins the military, how long do I need to serve in the military before I can become a US citizen? And is there an age restriction to joining the military?
Well, I don't know about the age restrictions. I think there is an age restriction, I'm sure. It's probably pretty young. I think most of the time is like under 30 or something like that. They did have a program many years ago where you can almost get instant citizenship if you were in the US on another type of visa and you had either a language ability, which included Yoruba language was one of the languages that they wanted to have people join the military for, or if you were a medical doctor or a medical nurse. Those were the options many years ago. They don't have that program any longer. So the military, it's kind of up to them how they do it, but I think they can actually offer, if you are a permanent resident, you can certainly sign up for the military. And if you meet all the other qualifications as well, and then they would basically decide from there in terms of the citizenship requirements. But usually it's a lot faster than having to wait for the 5 years.
Okay. Sorry. I think there's one more question.
Sure.
I'm sorry. Is it possible for me to get a job as academic and be sponsored by those employer? I think this person maybe gets a job as a university lecturer or something. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so university or a college, even if it's what we call a community college, which is typically a 2-year college curriculum. Yes, if you are sponsored by a university, if they hire you, and they can do the quickest way for them to get you here, and what they typically do is what's called an H-1B visa, as I mentioned. So that's a professional worker visa. We've worked with lots of universities that do that. So they work with people who are already here on student visas, but they also hire people from outside the US. But of course, it depends on all your qualifications. But yes, it is possible, and I know many universities that do that.
Okay. Yeah,
there's 2 questions. It looks like I see them popping up.
Even on YouTube, someone is asking, is it possible for an O3 to work? And what does O3 need to work if they can't work? Then we have about 2 other questions here. What exam do you advise someone that wants to study in the US to write first? No, it's not hand. I'll tell you to what exam to write. Okay.
Yeah.
Someone says that
The
question
O,
was skipped. Karachi, can you repost your question? So this
but the
person,
O3.
let's go on the O3
Mhm.
person. Is saying, what is the fastest route to get an O3 status to work?
Yes, so O3 cannot work. So O3 is children under age 21 and spouse. So spouse and children, both of them cannot work at all during the time that they're O3. So really, it's really to either getting into the green card process where the O1 worker or the O1 person applies for the green card, and eventually once you get the green card, or at least are in the stage of applying for the green card where you get a work authorization card, then you can work. That's going to be the best route. Otherwise, you would have to find an employer who can either sponsor you for an H-1B or qualify on your own for an O1. But there's no conversion of O3 to any kind of work status. You have to just find an independent qualification for a visa. But the best route is to get into that green card process.
Okay. Okay, this person has reposted a question. You mentioned education. Is there any fast track for people in education looking to leave and work in the US in education? I think she has answered that question. The other
well,
question,
I can briefly answer a little
and
bit
she,
more on
he
that.
asks for something further. Does being physically challenged affect your chances?
Does what?
Being physically challenged, does it affect your chances?
Oh, okay. No, not necessarily. No, I don't think that should affect your chances at all if you qualify in every other way for a particular visa. Now, for immigrant visa, there is a, a medical exam that's required. So green card applications, whether it's in the US or outside the US, have to go through a medical exam. But that's only for things like communicable diseases that they're looking for, not for physical challenges that won't affect anybody else in the US. So that should not be an issue as long as you meet all the other requirements for a green card or for a temporary visa. The education one, real quick, praise. So I think just to be clear again, when I mention education, there's nothing like blanket, like if you're in education, that's what you're going to get is a visa automatically. You just basically have to qualify for any other, any way that I just mentioned, O1, H1B, national interest waiver, EB1, it's still the requirement. If you can find a job, there is a very big shortage of teachers. I don't know, Praise, if you've been hearing about all the shortage of teachers that they have in the US, and it's a real problem. If you can find a position, a school district or even a private school that's willing to, or a university that's willing to sponsor you, then that's the quickest way.
Okay, another question just popped in. Hello, my younger brother just got his US citizenship. He's been away for over 10 years and didn't get to see our parents, especially dad who passed in 2021. He wants to apply for our mom so she can spend some time with him as he may be unable to take off time of work. He works in an hospital. Can I book a session with you to know the fastest route for him to use?
Sure, definitely. I think, Praise, you can give them my contact info.
Yeah, so what we're gonna do, if you are interested in booking a clarity session with Anne, they're gonna drop a form in the chat box, and if you're on YouTube, you're gonna have a form, a Google form. Just write your details. We just need your email address and maybe your number. Then I'll do a mail to Anne with all the email addresses of people who want to book clarity session. Then she'll send you a link to book your clarity session with her. Okay, so that's the process. So that I don't want to give out her email address, because that might be too cumbersome. And also we need to protect the integrity of this house, especially the people we're recommending to her as well. We don't want anything that is shady and anything like that. So please, admin, can you drop the link? Yeah, so the link has been dropped. Yeah, so that's the link. You can just pick it up and paste it on your maybe Google link or something like that. Okay, looks like I have another question. How can I get a reliable agent to link me up with Research Institute. No, that's not Anne's job. That's not our. We're strictly doing whatever. So please just pick up that link, the short URL .at, and please fill the form, and we'll capture your details. The link is not clickable, maybe because it's dropped in the chat. Tolani, please, can you check what's happening? I think you can just copy it and paste it on your browser. It works. Okay. Thank you very much, Anne. But one final question from me to you, Anne. Why does everyone want to move to the US? What's so special about the US?
Well, that's a big question. I imagine it's because of the opportunities. I mean, certainly people come here for the clients that I have worked with. They come here a lot for the opportunities for themselves and for their children as well. I don't necessarily have any understanding or can comment about what's going on in their own countries, but from what I'm told, it's just a lot more opportunity in the US. It's not perfect, for sure, because there are a lot of things that are not perfect and need work in the US, but the system in itself seems to be working for more people. And so I'm assuming that is the reason mainly that people come.
Okay, thank you very much. And I can't thank you enough for all you do for all of us. You are the first name on my mind when somebody says to me, I want to come to the US, and you have never failed, to deliver. I mean, sometimes I'll send you messages, you might be very busy, but you find time to respond. So thank you very much for honoring us today by showing up here. It's also serious. We meet it was this community I started when I left Nigeria and I got to the US, and I feel, what can we do to give back, to our people? So every Sunday we meet here and we bring all kinds of people to come and inspire and share clarity. So I want to appreciate you, and I'm sure that you're going to help many of them who are going to show interest. And maybe this time next year, we're going to host Anne, maybe in the US, and bring her up and celebrate her.
That'd be great.
Because I believe that a lot of my people are qualified to actually be in the US. All right. Thank you very much, and God bless you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm pleased to be here. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Bye. Okay, everyone, thank you very much for joining us. I'll just take a few announcements and then we'll be out of here. So please kindly click the form, if you are interested, and then we'll do a mail